You seeing a call,
Yes.
Mr. Mallard? Oh, Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr. Chairman, this is a bill which is sort of relatively uncontroversial. I was lucky to be a member of the Select Committee that was dealing with it at the time, and I am pleased to be able to speak to Part 2. And I think it is fair to say that, relatively speaking, Part 2 is a smaller part of it, and but there is consequentials in there. There are areas that people need to talk about. I want to acknowledge the fact that the officials, while we didn't always agree with the policy and some of the options that were put there were not picked up by the government, the officials did do a good job. The regulations which are being revoked as part of this legislation, I want to say to the Minister that it is good to use primary legislation in order to revoke regulations, because it means that we've got it on the face of the legislation rather than people having to dive away to other areas in order for them to work their way through those particular issues. There are some things, clause 29, which frankly, it's a bit sad that we need legislation around officers maintaining secrecy, but we do. But the change here is a very small consequential amendment on the taking out a particular section 208A, which is the effect of revoking something earlier on. Can anyone Mr. Chairman, it is legislation which is in the, I think it's fair to say, the tidy up category of legislation, and I do have some problems with my colleagues from the Green Party on this legislation. I think that at some stage, even though we are heading towards, all of us have a policy intention of heading towards free education, the idea that you would vote against consequential amendments in a relatively minor bill because you're opposed to people being charged at university is something which I think is going beyond a standard principle to being one which is pretty hard to explain. I was sort of slightly surprised at that. Well, when I was a student, I was in the era, I think, looking at her slightly before my colleague, the Marion Street, but at the same institution, and I was of the group where I didn't do a 7th form year, or 6A, I think they called it. I didn't do 6A and went at that stage to university, and as a result of my sort of slightly better, what I was 16 and a half, and I was old enough. I was old enough but as a result of my slightly better than mediocre work in my first year, ended up getting a bursary in my second year. That's the way that it worked, and I can't remember it being an enormous amount of money, but the fees. Well, an early developer actually. I ended up with a year's extra study ahead of my colleagues who stayed at school, and we ended up with about the same bursary, and I'd had a much better time than they had over that period. But how much of that time was it the Students' Association? I think it was pretty automatic at that stage. But at that, I did CAF honours. And it was good. I mean, there was Bob Moody used to be in there in his caftan. Jim Baxter would be reciting poetry, and I tell you what, Jim Baxter's poetry never went to the student loan. You know, there was some really interesting poetry, but none of it came close to part 2 of the student loan exemption and miscellaneous portfolio provisions amendment bill. He never came close. It was, but I must say, it was it was something which was particularly interesting, and the idea that we would have this sort of legislation, thank God for that.
Carmel Sebaloni.
Mr. Chair.